we've seen in terms of the South African rand is it hit the resistance level 679 sometime yesterday. It's been in 681, it's been at 685, it's been at 688. So somewhere within that spectrum, we're going to see some kind of stability. Are we going to see it at the lower end or the higher end?
Morning, Lerato. Well, in our view, the rand has really been stuck in a trading range of about 675 to 720 since about September. And although it's at the lower end of the range now, we don't anticipate that it's going to breach that 675 to the downside this year. This is really based on just looking forward. Inflation is starting to rise in South Africa, and that's going to erode South Africa's real yield differential with most developed countries. And so just on that basis, we don't see much movement on the downside as far as the currency goes, either toward the end of this year or in fact even looking forward to 2011.
In terms of what we're likely to see at a policy level, Nomvuyo, we know that the rand's also been driven by the attractiveness of South African bonds. The bond market has been on a firming growth path, as analysts call it. We've seen inflows up to 66 billion rands coming into South Africa. As authorities grapple with the strong rand, looking for stability, how are these phenomena going to impact on it?
Well, Lerato, it's quite interesting because recently what we've seen, and perhaps in the last 2 months, is that inflows into South Africa have actually turned away from bonds and more into the equity market. So looking forward, one wouldn't anticipate that, for instance, changes to monetary policy are going to have as big an impact as they possibly did this year. South Africa's yield differential with developed markets is still quite large, but we're anticipating that rates are going to remain on hold for most of next year. So as far as policy goes, the Reserve Bank's probably going to stick to its current policy of just accumulating reserves, and we'll have to wait and see as far as any additional announcements in next year's budget speech, what the Treasury has in mind. We've seen recently they lifted prudential limits for investors who are now able to take greater amounts offshore, and over time that should contribute to rand weakness. But at the moment, those appear to be the two main policy tools.
Let's talk about exogenous factors, Nomvuyo, and data that's been released overnight. U.S. growth expansion of 2.6%. It's not a great figure, but it's an encouraging figure, and it's also led to experts revising growth figures and projections for 2011, somewhere in the region of 3.3% as an average internationally. What impact will that have on the South African rand and the economy in general?
Well, Lerato, U.S. growth came in, and the final estimate came in at 2.6% for the third quarter. And although that was short of market estimates of 2.8%, it had actually been revised upwards from an initial estimate of 2%. So not doing too badly as far as the U.S. goes. Clearly an improvement in U.S. growth in the fourth quarter and looking forward into 2011 is going to have an important impact on global growth and South African growth as well. I mean, the US remains one of our key export destinations, so certainly from a South African growth point of view, we would also be hoping to see a sustainable and quite marked recovery in the US economy.
I mean, obviously, I'm going to ask you a loaded question here, Nomvuyo. For US Treasuries, the yields may be pushed up with this data coming through by at least 100 basis points. Is that going to have any impact on the rand-dollar exchange rate? Because what we have seen is investors looking for yield coming to emerging markets, and hence what we've seen happening to the South African rand. Could this reverse the trend?
Very loaded question there, Lerato. But no, our base case view remains that the rand is actually going to depreciate mostly against the dollar for most of next year. We see a bit of dollar recovery, particularly against the euro in the first quarter of next year, because the sovereign debt crisis that's playing out in the Eurozone is going to actually boost the dollar exchange rate versus the euro, and then versus the rand. Just on a fundamental basis, we're not expecting fireworks from next year's growth, South African growth. In addition, inflation is rising, although it's expected to remain within the target band. That is going to some extent erode South Africa's real interest rate yield. So on the whole, we're actually expecting the rand to depreciate from current levels to about 7.20 by the second quarter of next year.